Hello, whatever you think of how he said it.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war,
you're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now.
It's hard to see how Ukraine is in anything but a weak position right now, and that was before US military aid and intelligence sharing were frozen. This time on Sitrep, we explain what cards President Zelensky does still hold and what options Ukraine has in a war that is still being fought hard day in, day out. Simon Newton joins us to assess the practical impact of American military supply suddenly drying up, and perhaps more importantly, when it will really bite for Ukraine. And former military attaché to Moscow and Kyiv, John Forman, helps us understand what could be done to maximise Ukraine's negotiating position if talks really are on the way.
Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
We always aim for constructive and informative conversation, but it's been quite a week though. So Mike, I'm going to offer you a moment to get thoughts and feelings off your chest before we dive into the explaining.
Well, it's a big turnaround in the background to the war. We said at the start of the year that the outcome during 2025 will not be determined by the battlefields of Ukraine or in the Black Sea. It will be determined by what happens in Washington and Moscow and Beijing and in European capitals. And so it is proving. And in effect, I think we're now drawing the conclusion that the United States has sort of changed sides in the war because, in effect, it's playing for something else. It's not really playing for an end to the fighting. It's playing for a more strategic partnership with Russia in the longer term. And Ukraine looks as if it will pay the price of that.
Well, we're talking about Ukraine's options to get to its strongest negotiating position. So we need to understand the starting point. How are things laid out and what is the balance of power on the ground in the war right now? Well, with us on our mission to explore and explain Ukraine's options is a Royal Navy veteran who describes himself as banned by Russia, decorated by Ukraine, John Forman, former military UK attaché to Moscow and Kyiv, and Sitrep's own expert on all things Ukraine, Simon Newton. Hello to both of you. Thank you so much for coming today. John, your assessment of how strong or how weak Ukraine's ground position is right now?
Well, I think on the ground, things haven't changed much over the last few months. Obviously, Ukraine managed to stem the Russian advance, or very slow, steady advance, which we've seen over the last year. But I think this is playing out, as Michael said, in the boardrooms and the salons of European capitals now, not on the battlefield. War is a political act. This is always going to end politically once Russia's initial invasion failed 3 years ago. The question, of course, is can Ukraine maximise its position in front of the antipathy coming from Washington and the continued, I think, Russian determination to see this through as far as possible. I think it's a time of maximum peril for Ukraine. I think the stakes are extremely high. And
Mike, how do you see the ground position right now?
Oh, the ground position is more or less as it was. The Russians are threatening Pokrovsk again for the third month running, but they haven't yet taken it, although things are pretty dire there. They haven't yet taken Chasiv Yar, although they're very, very close to it. They did take Terezk, but even then they haven't got full control of it. And the Russians still can't mount a sort of a moving offensive. They can't really create momentum. They can just keep creeping forward. So the longer the war goes on this year, the more territory the Ukrainians will lose, and they probably would lose the rest of the Donbass, Kramatorsk and Slavyansk in particular. But you still can't see the Russians making a big breakthrough if the Ukrainians are able to keep fighting at more or less this level. So it is a war of attrition. It's not without movement, but it is an attrition war, and the Russians themselves are paying a very high price for what gains they're making on the battlefield.
I was just going to add, I think, the steady Russian advance obviously can be assisted by Trump suspending arms and intel. Those suspensions reduce Ukraine's ability to defend itself. And the price of that decision would pay in Ukrainian lives, both military and civilian, and the inability of Ukraine to actually target Russian rear areas, which in turn slow down the advance. But I think Michael's right. the Donbass is the main effort for Russia in 2025. They want to push this slowly rolling through these so-called fortified towns, trying to get Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. But actually, if you look at Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, they're pretty getting closer and closer, ever closer to reaching those sort of territorial boundaries. But I think this is a war of endurance and survival and one of industrial production. And again, without US arms, which is the other thing that Trump suspended, I'm not convinced that Europe can quickly step up and fill that gap, which again leads to this sort of idea that Ukraine's on the back foot.
And Simon, you are studying the new details every day. What has caught your eye recently?
Well, in terms of the battlefield, what Mike obviously says is correct. That the Russians have tried to flank Prokofsk, this key city, this mining city that they've tried to take for some time. So that's still not happening. There's stories that they're effectively bogged down there. There's not much movement. So interesting figures emerged about the Russian recruitment numbers this week as well. About they're saying they've recruited 440,000 personnel in 2024, which is about 10,000 more than they were actually expecting to recruit. And interestingly, the number of convicts in the Russian army is increasing dramatically. It was something like 15% in last year. It's going to go up to about 30% next this coming year. And these are people who are in prison serving sentences, even people who are on suspended sentences on remand. They're actually having to close some prisons, we're told, inside Russia because they're actually lacking inmates to keep those places still running. There was also another story to the sort of the intelligence picture, essentially, about an attack that took place on a training area inside Ukraine, just south of Dnipro, about 60 miles from the front line. The Russians targeted it with Iskander-M cluster munitions. This was in the last few days, killing a number of Ukrainian troops there. We don't know how many yet, but it's obviously another indication that they're able to see what's going on. And obviously that plays into this whole story about the intelligence picture that America is, we're told, stopping the Ukrainians from having.
Yeah, let's move on to some of that detail now. That is where we are right now. But going forward, these big changes, the immediate pause of US military aid supplies and a shutdown of intelligence sharing from the US. Let's start with the intelligence, because even though it's only words and data, it bites immediately. How much, Mike, and what kind of intelligence was the US sharing with Ukraine?
Oh, well, originally it was sharing intelligence from top to bottom. So if that intelligence pause goes on for a long time, I guess the three levels, the sort of the general intelligence about where Russian forces are and what they're bringing towards the front and so on, just locational material. But then beyond that, there's a very specific intelligence required to use for targeting for Ukraine's own ground-launched missiles. I mean, they can be targeted without it, but it takes much longer and is much less certain. So without the targeting intelligence, then Ukraine's response will be much less. And then the most specific thing, of course, is that some parts of Ukraine's air defense system can't get into operation without American intelligence assets. So they're less able to do anything about these more or less nightly Russian air attacks. And last night there were more than 100 drones and missiles fired, and the Ukrainians are just less able to shoot them down, so more civilians get killed.
And Simon, just talk us through how that airstrike warning system works for ordinary Ukrainians, because you've experienced it on your visits to Ukraine.
Well, all Ukrainians have an app. There's actually two apps, but they use an app that effectively warns you very loudly about incoming ballistic missiles or drones, effectively as they sort of cross the border. So I've been in Kyiv a few times, and you obviously are told that it's inbound. An alarm goes off, and the Ukrainians themselves, I have to say, don't usually head for the shelter anymore. But people like ourselves, that's the indication that you head for the shelter. So it's a very comforting, I suppose, really, envelope to have, that you're warned that there is stuff inbound.
And John, France says it's stepped in to share intelligence. How's that as a replacement?
I don't think it's any replacement at all, to be honest. I think the breadth, the timeliness, the quantity and quality of the American intelligence dwarfs anything the French and the UK can provide autonomously. And I think Michael's right. It's not just people talked about air defences, what really matters to civilians or on the battlefield about which way the Russians are going to come and what their latest tactics are and what equipment, you know, sort of tactical stuff. But I think the wider intent, you know, what the NSA, the National Security Agency, the CIA give is sort of wider insights into Russian intent, which nobody else can get, as we saw before the invasion itself. So I may have said last year that Biden had been forcing the Ukrainians to fight with one hand tied behind their back, and Trump's now put the manacles on and now blindfolded the Ukrainians, and they're very much on the sort of military back foot.
And Mike, just how blindfolded are the Ukrainians? How does it leave them?
Not completely, but to a large extent. I mean, it is a big problem for them, and it has immediate effect, really immediate effect, whereas other things may take time to work through. This one affects them immediately. And of course, the even bigger vulnerability is Starlink, you know, the Elon Musk-based satellite system. And Elon Musk originally was very generous in providing that to the Ukrainians, and it was a huge advantage to them. And they worked a lot of their own systems, which they improvised very effectively, using Starlink as the base. If Starlink is turned off for their use, then although the Europeans have started to think quite urgently about how they might replace it, again, there's no easy replacement for that. And that could be, I mean, Starlink could be turned off as another ratchet on that's going to be turned on Ukraine, because that would make another big difference to their ability to carry on fighting.
All right, well, let's look at the physical military supplies that have been paused. Simon, what was Ukraine expecting that won't now be delivered?
Well, it's obviously difficult to come up with a definitive list, but I mean, US officials have told, I think, ABC News in America that about 90% of the military equipment that was committed to Ukraine has already been delivered. And that includes things like Javelin anti-tank systems and other munitions that they're dependent on. What's left in the pipeline, we don't quite know, but obviously there was the last big tranche that Biden signed off on before Trump took office. That was supposed to be delivered by August, we understand. And that includes some supplies for these American-made F-16s that Ukraine is now operating, along with some air defense missiles. I mean, it's worth remembering that the Ukrainians have some contracts with private American firms that they've already paid for, so we don't know whether they're going to be blocked. There's no indication that they are. And there's also, I've seen indications talk about half a dozen HIMARS, these artillery rocket systems that were also on their way to Ukraine and were due to be delivered very shortly. So those potentially could get caught up in this freeze as well.
And Mike, when will that actually impact Ukraine's ability to attack and defend?
Well, it starts having an effect fairly immediately. I mean, Ukraine's still got a fair few supplies, but what it doesn't have is the big ammunition stocks that only the United States can provide. I mean, lots of 155 artillery shells and lots of missiles for the MLRS system and the HIMARS missiles and so on, and the JATACMS missiles. So if they're restricted, they'll feel the loss of those really quite quickly. I mean, the pipeline is, in a sense, is good for another 4 or 5 months. But what will be in the pipeline for another 4 or 5 months is less and less what makes a big difference to the Ukrainians. And so that's their problem. And as we've been saying, the intelligence pause is debilitating from now on for as long as it lasts. It's, every day will be tough for the Ukrainians for as long as that intelligence is withheld.
And John, we know what you think about the intelligence, but what about the military supplies? How much can Europe do and how quickly to fill the gaps?
Yeah, but I think firstly we should say Ukraine's not in the position it was in 2022 when America and other European countries are having to empty their own arsenals and get it to Ukraine as quickly as possible to keep it in the fight. We know that the Ukrainian industry itself has stepped up. It's now much larger, much more capable. I think I saw some facts floating around. It's tripled in size in 3 years. It's now producing 35, maybe to 50% of its own arms, and another 25% is coming from Europe. So there's lots of arms coming in, as Michael said, stuff's coming off commercial supply as well, not just in Europe. But I think, I've seen estimates of 1 month to 6 months of supplies. I think there's been preloading as well. But I think what the Americans give are those exquisite blue ribbon capabilities, which Europe haven't provided or haven't been willing to provide. And the second thing, it's not just on weapons. The American reach on arms is on everything, training, support and equipment. So it's not just giving arms to the front line to soldiers to use. It's also, what about repairs? What about spare parts? What about training for F-16 pilots, small-time ammunition, all that has stopped. And I think that's going to have a sort of slow, debilitating effect on the Ukrainian ability to defend themselves in ways we may not yet know, and there may be pressure points. For example, logistics troops unloading supplies in Poland. The Americans have been doing that. Who does that now? That's a simple thing that needs to be done immediately.
The challenge there that you outline is absolutely immense. Simon, what gaps do you think Ukraine can fill, and what is it reliant totally on from outsiders?
Well, as they've said, these exquisite weaponry, ATACMS, HIMARS, Patriots is a massive one for the Ukrainians, and I've seen warnings that they could run out within a matter of weeks. So there are certainly things that they can't replace. They have, as I said, completely ramped up production, domestic production of certain things, armored vehicles, anti-tank weapons. They've producing now their own armored personnel carriers. I think they've increased it fivefold, but obviously from a very low base. I guess it's tech where Ukraine is really focusing its efforts. It's the drone situation, which is obviously an absolute key in this war. There's about 200 or so companies in Ukraine now making those drones, and it is the largest defense industry now that they have. Also looking at electronic warfare, so that those areas potentially they could take care of themselves. I mean, I think the biggest problem they've had, and I interviewed Alexander Kamyshin, who was the Minister for Strategic Industries in Kyiv, and he was telling me essentially that they can make more than they can actually afford. This is the problem. They don't have the money to pay the companies to give the weaponry that they actually need. I think they spent $64 billion on defense last year, and only $6 billion of that went into domestic defense. That was all the money they had. So that's one of the problems they have. It's not just making the stuff, it's actually having the money to buy it. That's the other issue. And
Simon, worth mentioning, it's an international coalition that's coordinating the military aid. Do we know John was saying about Americans offloading the equipment in Poland. Do we know how much of the US has frozen this logistic contribution and how it's affecting the delivery of kit that we and other nations have donated?
The aid, a lot of it goes through an airport in southwestern Poland, Zhezhanka. That's not breaking any confidences. That's sort of in the public domain. It's about 60 miles or so from the Ukrainian border. So I'm guessing the American element of that has stopped working, or not processing equipment. We do have British Army troops there, presumably RLC logisticians. I understand they're in double numbers. That's what I'm told by the MOD. I asked the question of the MOD whether it was affecting any of our shipments through that hub, if you like, and also obviously whether it affected any US made stuff that we're pushing through. And I was told that it wasn't going to affect any of those deliveries. So as far as our stuff, that's still flowing as I understand it.
Mike, you cut your cloth appropriately. Does there need to be a change of strategy to match the change of resources?
Well, I mean, the biggest change in strategy that might be adopted by the Western powers is to actually give the 210 billion in frozen Russian assets to Ukraine, because as we were saying, they lack the cash to run their own defense industries at a much higher level and to buy on the open market in the world market what they need. And there's a big legal argument about this, and an argument also about the effect on investment. But there's over 300 billion in frozen Russian assets sitting in Western banks. About 210 billion of it is sitting in European banks, mainly in Belgium. And so the argument is we are in such extraordinary circumstances now. The best thing we could do would be to actually just take the leap, give that cash, and there is a legal basis for it. It's not all illegal. There's one legal tradition which says you could do it. There's another legal tradition which said that you can't. But the big strategic leap would simply be to give that frozen Russian asset to Ukraine as part of, in a way, reparations for the attack that Russia launched on Ukraine in 2022, and that would help them greatly in present circumstances to actually develop their own arms industries and buy on the open market what they might want.
What do you think, John, about a change of strategy to match the change of resources?
Yes, well, first on that point about the 300 billion, I think that might be part of the peace negotiations, quote unquote, when they come. And the Russians, I think, have indicated they might be prepared to give some of that up towards Ukraine. So we'll have to see. But I noticed on von der Leyen's approach, that wasn't mentioned. And we'll have to see whether there's discussions in the margins of the European Council, whether Europe is prepared to go that way because of the risk to macroeconomic instability and all that. I think on the strategy, I mean, it depends who you're talking about. If you're talking about Ukraine, I think the strategy is to hang on and try and get back in the room with the Americans and stop the Americans giving away every bit of leverage that the Ukrainians seem to have, arms, defense, NATO territory. But I said it's not looking great at the moment, and I think Trump seems to be more prepared to do a deal with Russia rather than support Ukraine in its hour of need.
Okay, so before we talk more about the options for Ukraine going forward, we should, of course, get some thoughts from Ukraine itself. I've been talking to Maria Avdieva in Kyiv, where she's a non-resident senior fellow for the Foreign Policy Research Institute.
Russia did not stop attacking Ukraine for a second since they invaded more than 3 years ago. And on the contrary, Russian attacks have intensified. And if to look at the front lines, soldiers to whom I talked to, they say that Russian attacks only intensified in the last weeks, and they are doing their best to hold their positions because they say we defend our country, our families, which are behind us. So they're really holding tight to their positions, but they say that Russians try to be more active in grabbing more Ukrainian territory.
And have you noticed a difference in Kyiv where you are? Are you being attacked every night?
Yeah, that's exactly so. I already lost the count of how many sleepless nights we had here, and this means it's just not the air raid for an hour. So the attacks usually starts at, let's say, 11 p.m. in the evening, and it goes on for hours. So you either ignore the air raid and go to sleep, risking that one of the Shahid drones will hit the building you are living in, or you go to the bomb shelter, especially those people with small children. They do go to the bomb shelter, and then you have a sleepless night because obviously there are no conditions there for sleep or for a night over.
And you have lived with the reality of war now for 3 years. How has that diplomatic spats, the blows that we've seen in the last few weeks, how have they affected the mood in Kyiv?
Well, people are quite stressed because of that, because Ukraine heavily relies on U.S. military aid, and this is a lot of that was used to defend Ukrainian cities. And people now say, okay, now when there will be a shortage of ammunition, which we will face very soon, then the Ukrainian armed forces will have to decide what they have to defend first, whether this will be residential areas or cities or energy infrastructure or some military sites. So because when you don't have enough, you have to make priorities, and people feel vulnerable because of this uncertainty if Ukraine will have enough to defend itself. But on the other hand, people are very, I would say, united and in the call that we are here defending our country, because otherwise we will be crushed and destroyed. So we just need to overcome everything, whatever this political situation brings us.
You talk about the difficult decisions that have to be made in prioritizing what may or may not need to be protected. That impact of the US pausing military aid, where are the biggest pressure points, and is there a plan?
Well, of course, the biggest pressure will be on the front lines, because this is where it's most critically needed. With the constant attacks, the military, they need shells for artillery. They need personal carriers because they got destroyed in the combat. And all of this thing the military just need basically on a daily basis. But also for civilians, it's a threat, because to shut down all of these missiles and Shahid Russia launches, there is a huge need for missiles, for example, for U.S. Patriot systems, U.S.-made Patriot system, because none of them were supplied by the U.S., but the missiles were. The military will have to decide whether they have capabilities to hit the upcoming missiles fired from Russia, and this puts a lot of pressure on generally on the situation, not only on the battlefield, but for security of people here.
That prospect of the US cutting off its military support to Ukraine was something that had been talked about before Donald Trump was elected US president. It was something that had long been feared that might happen. Does it feel like Ukraine's government has got a plan to cope without US support, or do they have to just keep going and hope that something else comes along?
Well, Ukraine was preparing for that, developing its own military capabilities and tightening connections and cooperation with the partners in terms of getting more military aid. And as you know, the bilateral agreements were made with almost all European countries to get support from them. But the thing is that Europe was not acting fast enough. And even when we face now the possibility, or at least not the possibility, but the actual cut of the military aid, this means that not all of this will be possible to replace immediately, and this will take time, and this time Ukraine does not have. But the resolution here is that Ukraine will be able to withstand. The thing is that Ukrainians want to get to peace, because this is what people here are really looking forward to. The important thing is that we get peace on the conditions that are favorable for Ukraine, and for that, to negotiate from the position of strength, Ukraine needs military strength, and this is why the situation with the military supply is so critical.
Maria, you've been living with this now for 3 years. How do you feel about your future and that of your country?
That's a hard question, and like me personally, I will stay here in Ukraine. I never considered leaving the country, but I know that a lot of people, especially those with the families with small children, they are terrified that what the future might bring them. There is a lot of hope that we will get to the peace this year, but zero intentions from Russia at the moment that they really want to get to the peace, or because they show no sign that they move into the direction of stopping attacking Ukraine. So there is a lot of concern here, and people, because in the uncertainty brings the biggest threat with it, but then you don't know what the future will bring to you. So many people are kind of frozen and waiting for what will be the developments, and preparing. Some of them are actually preparing for wars. What will they do if the situation for them or for their families gets worse?
Maria Avdieva, I wish you all the best. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
We should, of course, acknowledge President Zelensky's point that this is a war, not a game of cards. But as useful shorthand, what cards does Ukraine hold right now, Mike?
Well, they may not be high-value cards at the moment compared to who holds the aces. But, I mean, one card that Zelensky holds is still the very strong support, at least politically, from European leaders, most European leaders. That's important. And that means that if the Ukrainians decided that they will just fight, even without a clear strategic objective, they may do that. So the idea that a decision can be taken by Trump and Putin and just imposed on Ukraine is unrealistic. If the Ukrainians say, well, no, we just fight, we'll just carry on because we're facing destruction if we don't. So that's a card that they can play for some time, but you've got to ask yourself, what is the strategic objective? You can lose more territory, more people will be killed. You may lose in any case in the long run. But sometimes governments and peoples decide that nothing remains but to fight, just in blind hope that by carrying on you avoid the worst. And then there's another little straw. I was looking at some Reuters polling, which is very interesting, I thought, that the American public, only 7% of the American public accept what is now the White House line that the Ukrainians brought this war on themselves. 70% think that 70% of the American public say the war was started by Russia, who invaded, and 23% didn't know. But this White House line that somehow it's Ukraine's own fault, and the line that you're getting from people like Tulsi Gabbard, of course, who's the National Intelligence Director, she said this all the time. I mean, she's known in the Russian press as Russia's girlfriend, and she was called that some time ago. This line is not resonating at the moment with the American public. And that, I think, is a sort of a sliver that we could think about when we think about Ukraine's standing across the world.
What do you think, John? What options do you think Ukraine has? What cards does it have to play?
Cards. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously we spoke about the army, it was about 1 million strong and highly experienced, who slowed the Russians down to a crawl. I think they, as we spoke about defence industry, I think they've got the support of the people. Zelensky's got the support of the people. And although there is, politics have not gone away, I think the political class are pretty united, notwithstanding Trump's attempts to peel away people like Tymoshenko, the gas princess, and other various pro-Russian corrupt voices from the past. I think they've got public sympathy in Europe. I'm always struck coming back when I came back from Russia to see the number of Ukrainian flags and how political support, Parliament, for example, spans all sorts of people you'd never imagine to be on the same page. And they've got the moral high ground, and they've got economic resources, perhaps for trade, to trade as part of a deal. But if the Americans pulled the plug permanently, I think they would be in a different position. But I think it comes back to Michael's point. What does victory look like for Ukraine? If 80% of Ukraine remains sovereign, democratic, and increasingly prosperous through links to the European Union, they managed to fight off a long-term Russian invasion, and if they can get security guarantees, they might say that was worth the fight. But again, that's only a question the Ukrainians can make, not us.
And Mike, what options do you think Ukraine does have to actually strengthen its position, its options right now?
Well, its best option, I think, as John was indicating earlier on, is to try to strengthen its domestic production, its own arms production, because it's not without advantages there, and it's been very inventive. If they can really ramp up their domestic production, it would give them the ability to carry on, even in a sort of broken-backed way. And they still have to play for the support of the wider world. And the sympathy of the wider world, is, in the sense that they are clearly the underdogs in what looks like a great power stitch-up. That's the way it's emerging, as far as we can tell. So they've got to try and do a bit of everything. But if they carry on, regardless of whatever Trump and Putin now come up with, then they'll have to do it in different ways, simply to indicate that they're not just going for another month for self-respect, that they really can carry on into next year and maybe the year after, in ways that will stretch the Russian economy somewhat.
John, what about Kursk? What about the land that Ukraine holds there? Should it push harder, or use the troops that are based there to push harder back in Ukraine?
Well, I think I've spoken to you before, Kate. I'm not a great fan. I never have been of the Kursk incursion. I'm not sure how it helps Ukraine strategically. I mean, it's okay to have a sliver of Russian land as a bargaining chip, but if the Russians don't want to bargain with you on it, or the Americans haven't got your back, then I'm not sure how much of a chip it is. And of course, I think the question is, if the American arms embargo continues, Ukraine has choices. It can change its tactics, both in Donbass. It could also decide to straighten its lines and pull back to reuse those troops elsewhere. So I think there might see a change in that. I think also that Kursk pocket, or the occupied area by Ukraine, has also shrunk dramatically. It's under severe pressure. So the question is, do you use your artillery to defend part of Russia, or do you use your artillery, if there's shells, to defend the Donbass? So, that's a question for the Ukrainians. I think the latter.
And Mike, you mentioned earlier the possibility of using frozen Russian assets, not the profits on them, the actual assets. Have you got any other radical ideas?
No, I wish I did, Kate. I mean, I wish I could say there's something out there, if only we could bring ourselves to do it, that could be done. I mean, the time for more radical ideas has passed, really. We could have been much more radical in 2022. And accepted that this was a strategic challenge and got on with it then. And Ukraine will be in a much, much better position now. But I think it's just more of the same. If I could think of anything better. I mean, people have said, well, why don't they go to the Chinese? Why don't they turn to the Chinese for help? But the Chinese will only offer help that was somehow twisted towards allowing the Russians to do what they want. So I don't think there's any alternative for the Ukrainians but to rely on their other European neighbours. And I think they'll be making that argument very, very strongly. The other thing I suppose they could do is that they could try to change leader, but that's got to be a decision for them. And Zelensky, still has a lot of support in Ukraine. And the more he's attacked by the White House, the more support he's getting in Ukraine. And so even people like Poroshenko and Tymoshenko are not keen on being seen as American puppets to be put in so that they can then become Russian puppets. And so, but I think if there were if the Ukrainians could select a different leadership group that was their choice, genuine choice, that might make some difference politically. But again, I mean, it's quite dangerous to do that just at the moment for them.
And John, do you think there is any radical shift that Ukraine could make?
No, I do. I agree entirely with Michael. We could have put troops into Ukraine in 2021 to try and deter the Russian initial attack. Under Biden, the approach was to stop Ukraine losing but not allow it to win. And now we're seeing the consequences of 2.5 years of dither under Biden and Trump's determination to focus on China and do a deal with the Russians. I think fundamentally, the American administration doesn't care much about Ukraine. It sees it as a European problem, as a minor issue. With the America's major challenge as being China, and it's prepared to see this problem go away, which it sees as an irritant to its, and not a core American security concern. So I think we are where we are. I think, as somebody said before, it's keeping Ukraine in the fight long enough, making sure that when it does enter peace negotiations, which are coming, it hasn't lost more ground. It's not having to negotiate from a position of even greater weakness.
Let's get some final thoughts now, and I'm grasping for a glimmer of hope here. Simon, Ukraine has been adapting and surviving for 3 years now, though, hasn't it?
It has, yeah, and I think it will continue to do so. I think if you meet their troops, I've met them in Ukraine on the front line on Challenger 2 tanks, and I've met them on the Interflex training here, being trained by British soldiers. And I think you have to, when you meet them, you have nothing but admiration for the kind of fortitude of them. They will want to fight on, I guess, but everything has changed as we've kind of concluded from our chat today, and this intelligence loss is going to be massive. You talked about Kursk a second ago. I mean, there's 620,000 Russian troops now in Kursk, about 200,000 apparently actually on the front line fighting. So, the numbers are immense. So they will adapt and survive, but I think this is probably the most difficult moment of this entire war we're in right now.
And John, you've worked with Ukraine's military. How are they going to be coping?
Well, I think, one of the things I was listening to that clip was about the morale issue. I think the Russians are quite clearly targeted the Ukrainian population for 2.5 years. We had a dip in public morale the last time the Americans suspended arms for 7 months, and I think you're seeing that play out again. And of course, the troops, it's not lost on the troops, because if they're at the front line, they're seeing their families and loved ones being bombed. That's going to have an effect on the front line as well. So although we talk about arms and tactics and drones and intelligence, I think morale, ultimately, war is as much about morale and about sustaining itself in the fight as it is about kit. On glimmers of hope, I think the two things I'd take away from a very, very bad couple of weeks, if Trump's only been president for 50 days, is firstly, wider Europe is taking defence seriously finally, after 30 years of not taking it seriously. And secondly, that European of global solidarity with Ukraine remains pretty solid, and they have powerful friends within Europe, places like Turkey and elsewhere. So it's not a done deal. And I think, last week the Russians were sort of worried about Ukrainian doing a deal with America on rare earths, and then everything blew up on Friday. Then they've been crowing again. It could quite easily go the other way if America and Trump see Russia as not being serious, and then Trump starts to open spigots again back to Ukraine, both with arms and intel, and ups sanctions.
And Mike, has the US created a tipping point then?
Yes, I think it has, and I think we can see it in the behaviour of the last couple of weeks. That the apologists for President Trump say, look at the strategy. I mean, his tactics are always to move forward and break things and create uncertainty. Those are his tactics. But his strategy is to stop the fighting and leave Ukraine as a viable sovereign entity that can look after itself. That's the strategy. That's where we want to get to. Well, that's fine if he can pull a rabbit out of the hat, but with the exception of one slight slightly off-the-cuff comment he made, everything that he has said and everything the administration has done in the last couple of weeks go completely against that strategic destination they say they want to get to. And then the apologists say, look, it's all about carrots and sticks. Well, yes, it can be about carrots and sticks, bringing two sides to a negotiating table. But at the moment, the Russians are being offered nothing but carrots, and the Ukrainians are suffering nothing but blows with sticks. I mean, there is no day goes by without the White House and the Republican supporters on the Hill and wider insulting and laughing at Ukraine, beating up Zelensky in the most ridiculous way. And not a word is said about Putin. In fact, again, in the hearings that we're down to second level hearings now for people in deputy sec positions in the Pentagon, they're asked by Congress, is this or not an invasion? And they won't use the word invasion. They say 190,000 troops and armoured vehicles and all the rest of it crossed the border into Ukraine. And no, I don't regard it as an invasion. I mean, this is just Alice in Wonderland stuff, but that sadly is where we are.
And where we are is the end of Sitrep for this time. Thank you to Mike, John Forman and Simon Newton. That is all for now. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. Who knows what will have happened by then. But whatever does, you can stay up to date on our website, forcesnews.com. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.